In space, as the saying goes, no one can hear you scream, except in Spelljammer. You can float through space and breathe, and where there is a way to breathe, there is a way to hear someone scream. GameMasters here, and air envelopes are a thing in Spelljammer. It's based on size, but yeah, air envelopes have existed since Spelljammer came out way back in 2nd edition, and of course they extend into its 5th edition counterpart. While there are other elements that didn't translate over, the core thing that I want to look at today is space combat for 5th edition. While 2nd edition painted out some great rules for space combat, for example, if you didn't grow up in space and you don't live or work in space, you'd see a +6 added to your initiative rolls, which generally means that you'd be going last, and you'd see a -2 penalty to your attack rolls. 5th edition doesn't cover that element, nor does it go into what actually happens when you encounter a group of other Spelljammer ships in battle. What we are provided are just some very simple basics. It tells us that the DM decides how far away the other ships are, out to about 1,000 feet or so. And while we are provided a small table of sorts that references the types of ranged weapons that will work at that relative distance, 5th edition then explains something really odd for space combat. I always thought that it would be fun to have a D&D version of some ship-to-ship battle, something akin to the epic space battle in Star Trek's Wrath of Khan. And while that would be fun to play out via Spelljammer ships, instead, 5th edition tells us a spelljamming ship typically has one or more shipboard weapons, ballistae and mangonels, being the most common. Such weapons are slow to load and fire. Player characters are almost always better off using their own weapons and spells in ship-to-ship combat, reserving shipboard weapons for targets that are too far away to be damaged by other means. And then it goes into how to move and steer your Spelljammer, and then ultimately how to board the enemy's vessel. Then you go directly into melee combat. There aren't any actual ship-to-ship rules. 2nd edition went in depth on how to do ship-to-ship combat in the Book of Concordance of Arcane Space, and they devoted an entire chapter, 19 total pages, to movement and combat in space. And I'm talking full-on pages of information with very few pieces of artwork. So it was detailed, and while it does work, and it can be converted to 5th edition, I found a much simpler fix. Why am I just now coming out with a video about space combat for Spelljammer? Well, at my table, we've only recently started using the Spelljammer material as we've had a nice backlog of other things that I wanted to get to. And while I addressed this lack of space combat rules in videos at the time that this box set came out, it's only now that I have really started to dive into needing that type of a mechanic. Thankfully, the fix is super simple, and it's one that Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson actually came up with for ship-to-ship movement and combat in space a long time ago. Oh, okay, it's not exactly space combat. It's listed as aerial combat, but in Book 3 of the original White Set book for Dungeons & Dragons, The Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, it is recommended to have a map of sorts and to use miniatures, and it is the core of this that we'll be using for our space combat rules, along with a tiny touch of homebrewery. We've done this at my table, and it works perfectly for space-going Spelljammer combat. The map that I have is a grid map, broken into 1-inch boxes. You can make this as big as you'd like, but my map was printed on a 13 by 19 inch sheet of paper. And if you'd like a copy of this to print out, I've got a pack of these available over on my Patreon for contributing members. Of course, if you have some fun terrain tables and whatnot, you can always use that as well. What I have found that works pretty well are some printouts of various Spelljammer ships and paper clips. You just cut them out, bend the paper clip a bit, and tape them into place. Of course, if you have the miniatures, that's all the better. Imagine being able to cruise through space, enter a battle, and be able to maneuver forwards, backwards, port starboard, but also up and down, actually gain or lose altitude. To do this, we'll place a die at the base, or at least close enough to the corresponding miniature. This is going to represent the ship's altitude relative to the other ships in that area. While the White Book provides movement, we'll make use of the actual Spelljammer ship's movement. In our hero's example, they'll be flying the Bombard, which has a fly speed of 35 feet. Because my squares are broken down into 1-inch size, I'm going to do a little bit of rounding for the ship's movement, but if I wanted to move forward, each square would represent 10 feet. Of course, if you have a larger area and you want to use a ruler or tape measure, that works too. Remember our die at the base at the mini? Well, if I wanted to move up or down, the number on the die would represent how many feet up or down that ship is. When beginning combat, it is assumed that each ship enters in on the same level, but they can increase or decrease altitude should they want during the course of combat. Gygax and Arneson recommended writing out orders and turning them in so that everything can happen at the same time. Weapon fire happens after all movement is made. They state, "It is suggested that orders be written so that simultaneous movement is possible. Orders need only indicate the direction, length, and altitude gain or loss. Firing missiles is always allowable at the end of a turn unless the firer is meleeed and unable to do so. It is therefore unnecessary to record firing instructions." Now, this is a mechanic that is similar to a board game called Diplomacy. Each turn, players will write down their movement, and then at the end of that round, those orders are read out loud. And this just helps to simulate action and movement all happening at the same time. In this version of Spelljammer's combat, after the orders are read, then ships' weapons can be fired if anything is within range. Now, I have found that this method of writing down orders works best when there are multiple targets to fight. Keep in mind, spacefaring creatures can also be a part of these massive space battles. If it's just your ship versus another, there's less likely a need for writing down orders, and likewise, if it's the DM that is actually running all of the opposing ships, and the party is just running their one single ship, again, writing down orders might be unnecessary as well. But your mileage may vary. Missile fire is a section in here that depicts anything coming from one ship and going towards another. It could be cannon fire, a massive bolt from a ballista, or a myriad of other projectile weapons and ammunitions. Remember when we talked about altitude? Use that as a tactical advantage. Get above your target. The aerial rules allows for you to slam down into your opponent, to crash into your target. For every 1 inch of height down you go, roll a d6. So if you are crashing down 30 feet into an enemy ship, you're going to roll 3d6. Add the total and apply the 5e crashing mechanic, then add your d6 totals as bludgeoning damage to whatever it is that you crashed into. Assuming it wasn't a rock or asteroid, the target takes the full amount, and your ship will take half of that. At that point, your boarding party can infiltrate the enemy ship, and hand-to-hand melee combat can begin. Similarly, if you're positioned above your target, you can just drop bombs down on them. And if you'd like to get a copy of the 2nd edition Spelljammer rules, these or the White Box rules, I'll leave links down in the description as well as the pinned comment underneath this video as to where you can get them. While there is always room for improvement, this is something we've tested at my table and it seems to work very well as a fix. Of course, I'd love to hear what your fixes have been regarding space combat for 5th edition Spelljammer. Talk to me down in the comments below. I also want to invite you all to join my Discord as we have some fantastic discussions there regarding not only Dungeons & Dragons, but other tabletop role-playing games as well. And I'll leave a link to that down below. And I need to also thank all of my YouTube and Patreon supporters. The list just keeps growing and growing, and I cannot thank them enough. Their contributing support helps make it so that I don't have to take on sponsored ads. But all of this is a great way to help shape the future of this channel. After all, the content that I make is largely inspired by you, the viewer. I love the interaction, and I try my best to reply to every comment made. So to that end, if you found some fun ways to implement space combat in 5th edition Spelljammer, or if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. But let's continue the discussion down in the comments, and until next our paths cross, may you not come face to face with a goon balloon. But if you do, watch this video next.